From the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the studio floor, there was an unspoken tension that filled the space. Piers Morgan, known for dominating interviews and controlling the narrative through provocative questioning, had a clear strategy. His goal wasn't just to extract policy details, it was to push Crockett off balance, to evoke a reaction that would feed into his style of television, confrontational, bold, and headline-worthy. What he didn't anticipate was how she would handle that pressure, not with volatility, but with a poise that turned the tables entirely. As the segment began, Piers leaned into his familiar rhythm. He opened with pressing questions on crime statistics, suggesting that her political stance catered more to progressive optics than measurable outcomes. Crockett answered calmly, nodding slightly, acknowledging the issues but countering with facts, community perspectives, and a clear grasp of policy nuance. Piers moved quickly, cutting her off mid-sentence several times. It was a technique he often used to assert control. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she recalibrated, waited for her opening, and then returned to her points with an even sharper edge. The audience could sense it. She wasn't just surviving this interview. She was navigating it with precision. Then came the turning point. Piers pivoted the conversation, shifting from policy to personality. He referenced her most watched House hearing clips, suggesting they were more about theatrics than governance. "You seem to enjoy the camera, Congresswoman," he said, his tone bordering on dismissive. The implication was clear. She was more performer than policymaker. For a brief second, the air seemed to thin, but Crockett didn't take the bait. Her posture remained unchanged, her expression steady. And that's when she struck. With no raised voice, no insult, just measured confidence, she replied, "Piers, you confuse passion with performance because you've made a career out of both. But I don't have to shout to make sense, and I don't have to insult others to make a point." The studio fell into an uneasy hush. It wasn't the line itself that stunned the room. It was the way she delivered it. Smooth, controlled, razor-sharp. The very tools Piers used to dominate others on air were now being reflected back at him effortlessly. He tried to recover, throwing out another comment about her media appearances, questioning whether her primary focus was visibility over responsibility. But the momentum had shifted. Crockett didn't just respond, she dissected the question, reframed it, and put the spotlight right back on the interviewer. Her strategy wasn't to escalate, it was to remain grounded, making his provocations appear increasingly hollow. For viewers at home, the shift was palpable. They weren't watching a typical verbal brawl, they were witnessing a breakdown in the usual power dynamics. Piers, typically the conductor of chaos, found himself quietly recalibrating, less sure-footed than before. Crockett, on the other hand, stayed unshaken. The control he expected to maintain was slipping, not because she was louder, not because she interrupted, but because she refused to play the part he expected of her. What made the moment even more potent was Crockett's unwillingness to be framed as an angry voice or a reactive figure. She was assertive, yes, but never unhinged. She didn't backpedal or dodge tough questions. She simply refused to let her identity be reduced to a talking point. In doing so, she challenged not just the interviewer's assumptions, but the framework of the interview itself. As the segment neared its end, it was clear to those watching that something rare had occurred. Piers Morgan, usually the one leaving his guests scrambling to recover, was left navigating new ground. Jasmine Crockett had done more than hold her own. She had flipped the format. Where many expected fireworks, she delivered firepower through discipline, clarity, and an unflinching command of her voice. The power dynamic, once firmly in the hands of the interviewer, had quietly but unmistakably shifted. Not with spectacle, not with outbursts, but with something far more disarming, grace under pressure, and a refusal to lose control. In the world of live television, where dominance often belongs to the loudest voice, Crockett proved that control belongs to the calmest mind. When Piers Morgan brought up Jasmine Crockett's viral moments during the interview, his tone was unmistakably loaded. He referenced the clips that had circulated widely on social media, those heated committee room exchanges where Crockett didn't hold back in challenging her opponents. To him, those moments were ammunition for a larger accusation, that her style was more spectacle than substance, more optics than outcome. What followed, however, was a striking moment of clarity that peeled back layers of a persistent issue. How? Women of color in public life are so often mischaracterized for simply standing firm. Piers didn't frame it directly as a racial critique. He didn't need to. It came through in the subtext of his questions, in the way he questioned her tone, her language, and her style. With a kind of practiced condescension, he asked whether her confrontational approach was really helping her constituents or merely building her brand. Crockett didn't flinch. She understood what was happening. The suggestion wasn't just that she was too loud, it was that she was too much, too direct, too unapologetic, too visible. Instead of defending herself, emotionally, Crockett calmly dissected the premise. She acknowledged that her clips go viral, not because she aims to entertain, but because what she says reflects a frustration that resonates with people who are tired of coded criticism and selective outrage. Her ability to communicate with fire and clarity wasn't a performance. It was a response to persistent double standards. She pointed out how often women like her are told to tone it down, to speak more professionally, to avoid being labeled as angry or aggressive. But rarely, if ever, are men held to the same standards when they raise their voices or dominate space. Piers tried to push back, citing examples of politicians from both sides of the aisle who had been criticized for their conduct. But Crockett was ready. She didn't generalize. She spoke from her own experience. She described how, as a black woman in Congress, she is expected to be everything at once. Knowledgeable, but not arrogant. Strong, but not too assertive. Passionate, but never emotional. The tightrope she walks isn't just political, it's cultural. And the very clips that Morgan mocked were, in her view, expressions of authenticity in a system that often demands conformity. The conversation, at that point, began to take on a deeper tone. Crockett spoke not just for herself, but for countless others who have been misinterpreted and misrepresented because they didn't fit neatly into someone else's expectations. She questioned why calling out hypocrisy or refusing to back down in a hearing was seen as theater when she did it, but called firm leadership when done by others. The audience started to murmur again, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The truth she was telling wasn't controversial. It was simply something rarely said aloud in such a public space. Morgan, to his credit, seemed caught off guard. Not because he hadn't heard these arguments before, but because he hadn't expected Crockett to reframe the conversation so effectively. She wasn't reacting. She was exposing a flaw in the lens through which people like her are viewed. She shifted the ground beneath the interview, making it clear that style and substance weren't opposing forces in her world. They were tools she used in tandem to challenge systems that have never made room for voices like hers. The most telling moment came when she looked directly at him and said, "You say it's performance when I speak plainly and push back. But maybe what's really shocking is that someone like me is finally being heard without asking for permission." There was no applause line, no dramatic pause, just a truth delivered plainly. The camera lingered on Morgan's face, his usual smirk softened, perhaps unsure whether to challenge or pivot. The impact of that moment rippled far beyond the studio. On social media, the conversation exploded. People weren't just sharing the clip because it was fiery. They were sharing it because it put words to something many had long felt but rarely seen addressed so directly. It was a confrontation not just between two individuals, but between two vastly different understandings of what power, presence, and legitimacy look like in the public sphere. In that brief exchange, Crockett didn't just counter a critique, she flipped it inside out. She made it about the system, the framing, the centuries-old assumptions behind the questions. She made it clear that her voice wasn't loud because she lacked substance. It was loud because she refused to be silenced by those who confused their comfort with correctness. Throughout the interview, there was an undeniable tension building, not from shouting or personal attacks, but from the sheer unpredictability of how Jasmine Crockett held her ground. Piers Morgan is well known for stirring the pot, creating uncomfortable moments, and keeping guests off balance until they trip over their own words. But this time, something entirely different was unfolding. Crockett didn't respond with volume or visible irritation. She didn't lean into dramatic gestures or flashy retorts. Instead, her power came from restraint, a deliberate form of control that left both the live audience and viewers at home stunned. The most unexpected part wasn't that she stood her ground, it was how she did it. Piers, trying to provoke, raised questions about her role in controversial hearings, her commentary on politically charged issues, and whether she took the legislative process seriously or just saw it as an opportunity to go viral. He smiled as he asked, leaning forward slightly, expecting a defensive or fiery response, but what came back was measured, steady, and surprisingly disarming. Crockett answered the question without flinching. She didn't deflect, didn't escalate. She simply walked through her process, explaining how her moments in hearings weren't planned performances, but reactions to being consistently interrupted, belittled, and dismissed. Her tone never wavered. Her eye contact never broke. There was no hint of anxiety, no rush to win the argument. It became clear very quickly. She wasn't playing the same game. What threw Piers off was that she didn't seem interested in giving him the emotional reaction he was clearly baiting. Instead, she maintained a calm demeanor, answering pointed questions with data, personal insight, and occasionally a well-timed one-liner that didn't feel like a zinger, but more like a factual correction. And it was that restraint that rattled the format. Where others may have shouted back, she simply exposed the flaw in the question and moved on. It wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. When he asked whether her sharp comments in hearings undermined her credibility, she paused, tilted her head slightly, and replied, "Is it that my words are sharp, or that I won't dull them to make people more comfortable?" The line hung in the air. The studio audience murmured in response, not out of shock at an insult, but because of the weight behind the question. There was nothing flashy about it, no raised voice, no smugness, just a clean, confident pushback that reframed the entire exchange. Piers leaned back, visibly recalibrating. It wasn't that he'd lost control of the interview in any obvious way. He was still asking questions, still holding the host's chair. But the energy had changed. The usual rhythm, question, tension, reaction, wasn't functioning. Crockett was speaking on her own terms, and he couldn't seem to provoke her off them. What stood out the most was the way the audience reacted, not with cheers or loud applause, but with quiet gasps, nods, and a growing attentiveness. They weren't watching a spectacle. They were watching a person remain completely composed under pressure, while quietly dismantling every attempt to push her off script. And that's where the shock came in, not from volume or confrontation, but from precision and discipline. Crockett's approach showed a different kind of strength, one that doesn't get celebrated nearly enough in public discourse. She didn't need to overpower her opponent. She simply refused to surrender control of the narrative. Even when Piers circled back to suggest that she benefited from controversy, she responded, "Controversy is a distraction. I'm more interested in consistency, and if that happens to make headlines, that says more about the headlines than it does about me." It wasn't what most people expected from a televised exchange with someone like Piers Morgan. Viewers tuned in assuming their A would be sparks, raised voices, dramatic cuts. Instead, they watched someone methodically and confidently diffuse every attempt at provocation. Crockett's performance, though she would likely reject that word, was a masterclass in staying grounded while being scrutinized, challenged, and underestimated. Her control didn't just neutralize the attacks, it redefined the energy in the room. She didn't allow herself to be portrayed as combative, emotional, or reactionary. She stayed composed, leaving Piers with few options but to move on or risk appearing increasingly desperate for conflict. And as the show wrapped, it was clear, to everyone watching, sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the loudest, but the one who refuses to be shaken. The most lasting impression from the interview wasn't a single quote or a viral exchange. It was the sense that something fundamental had shifted in how televised confrontations could be handled. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself or win an argument. She changed the entire framework of what it meant to come out on top in a high-pressure adversarial media setting. While Piers Morgan relied on his usual formula of dominance through interruption, emotional pressure, and sharp questioning, Crockett redefined the rules by refusing to play into any of it. And the reaction across social media proved that people noticed, because the win didn't come from overpowering him, but from making him irrelevant to the outcome. During the exchange, Piers seemed to expect a certain narrative arc. Build tension, create a conflict point, and land a moment that could be clipped and shared. He's built a career on manufacturing these moments. But Crockett had a different strategy. She didn't swing wildly hoping to land a punch. She moved with deliberate, thoughtful clarity, sticking to her values and calmly reasserting her presence in every moment. When he tried to redirect the conversation into gotcha territory, questioning her motivations, her tone, and her role in Congress, she didn't flinch or counterattack. She simply shifted the lens back to the issues that mattered. When he commented that she often comes across as more concerned with shining in viral clips than governing, she paused and said, "The truth doesn't always go viral, but if it does, maybe that's because people are finally listening." It wasn't a jab. It was an observation, one that drew immediate resonance. Crockett didn't perform for the camera. She revealed that maybe the camera was finally catching up to what real representation looks like. And that subtle reframing had a massive impact. The audience didn't need raised voices or explosive moments to sense who had control. They could see it in how composed she remained, in how she never gave him what he was fishing for. More importantly, Crockett's responses illuminated something deeper: how success in these televised environments often favors those who conform to a particular archetype, the confident, dominant, fast-talking host who controls tempo and tone. But by staying authentic and measured, she created a new kind of standard, one that resonated with viewers far beyond the studio. People online weren't celebrating her because she shouted him down. They celebrated her because she didn't have. So she demonstrated that substance, self-possession, and patience can overpower provocation, even when it's broadcast live to millions. This shift wasn't just symbolic, it had real impact. Clips of the interview were shared across platforms, not because they captured drama, but because they offered something people didn't often see: an intelligent woman, under fire, staying cool and dismantling assumptions, without ever losing herself. It became a lesson in how clarity and control are their own form of power. Viewers who had watched countless interviews with Piers where guests grew defensive or unraveled were now watching someone flip the experience entirely, without ever raising their voice. The shock wasn't in what Crockett said, but in how she conducted herself. She didn't need validation from the host, or to outwit him with snark. Her authority came from being grounded in her truth, and people noticed. By the end of the segment, even Piers seemed to recognize that he hadn't managed to shake her or pull her into familiar territory. He wrapped up the interview with a tone that was more subdued than how he'd started, as if acknowledging that this encounter hadn't followed the path he'd anticipated. In a media landscape that often rewards spectacle over sincerity, what Crockett did was quietly revolutionary. She didn't just answer questions, she reshaped the expectations for how someone in her position could respond under fire. Her calm composure didn't make headlines because it was flashy. It made headlines because it was rare. In doing so, she offered a new model for public discourse, one where strength is measured not by dominance, but by integrity. Piers may have walked into the studio thinking he would provoke a moment. Instead, Jasmine Crockett created a moment, entirely on her own terms, and changed the conversation for good. In the aftermath of the interview, the atmosphere shifted from tension to reflection, not just within the studio, but across the broader political and media landscape. Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Piers Morgan wasn't the explosive clash some viewers anticipated. It was something far more unsettling to the traditional power dynamics of television. It was balanced, unflinching, and completely within her control. Crockett didn't win by shouting louder or outspinning her host. She won by refusing to abandon her sense of self in the face of provocation. Piers Morgan, accustomed to crafting chaos and controversy, found himself encountering a guest who refused to be molded into a reactive figure. That was the real surprise. Not because she didn't have the fire to respond, she clearly did, but because she chose not to let the host dictate the emotional tone of the exchange. It left many viewers, and perhaps even Piers himself, reassessing what influence looks like on a national stage. The most telling consequence was the audience response, not only in the studio, where murmurs of respect could be heard at each of Crockett's calm rebuttals, but online where social media lit up with commentary. People weren't just impressed by what she said, they were struck by how she said it. In a media culture that thrives on sensationalism, Crockett reminded everyone that presence doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Her deliberate pacing, her refusal to escalate, and her precise language communicated something deeper than outrage: conviction. She didn't allow herself to be cornered into a moment that could be edited into clickbait. She gave the audience more credit than that, and in return, they respected her for it. It became clear that the shock wasn't that she had bested Piers Morgan, it was that she did so while appearing utterly unshaken, unbothered, and entirely on message. It was a subtle but unmistakable rejection of the rules that usually define political interviews. This interaction may not change the media overnight, but it planted a seed. Viewers saw that it's possible to hold firm without becoming hostile, to challenge a narrative without adopting the tone of battle. It offered a new vision of what it means to be strong in public life, one that isn't rooted in dominance or spectacle, but in clarity, purpose, and authenticity. Ultimately, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend her reputation in that interview. She reshaped it, and in doing so, she also reframed the way many now view figures like her, women who've been told to shrink, soften, or perform. By holding her ground with quiet power and unapologetic truth, she made a simple but lasting statement: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to bow.